Okay, should be fine now. Hello, everyone. Today we will be talking about the book Human Natures, Genes, Cultures, and the Human Prospect. This is the book, and I'm glad to announce that the author of this book, Dr. Paul R. Ehrlich, is with us today. How are you, Paul?
Uh, Breathing in smoke in California, but otherwise fine.
Okay, I will give a little introduction to the audience about Dr. Paul Ehrlich. He's a biologist best known for his warnings on the population growth and limited resources. He's the Bing Professor of the Population Studies in the Department of Biology at Stanford. He's the president of the Center for Conservation Biology there. He has written many books. Some includes How to Know the Butterflies, published in 1960, Process of Evolution, 1963, The Population Bomb, 1968, which is probably the most famous book written by Paul. Extinction, 1981, and Human Natures, 2002, and many more. So the book that we'll be talking about today is the Human Natures that is here. So Paul, I asked to many authors first that what brought you to writing? You have been writing for over 50 years now. I can track the books when it was published, and your last book was published I guess, in 2015. So what brought you to writing popular science books?
The answer is extremely simple. When Ann and I were graduate students, we had our daughter, and we were broke, and we could hardly afford food. But Ann was a very talented artist, and I was a specialist. I was doing my doctoral dissertation on butterflies, and Ann did glorious illustrations of butterflies in pen and ink. And we got a contract to write a field guide to the butterflies of North America. I, I guess I don't have a copy of it around handy, but she did the illustrations, and we managed to, I think, make a total of something like $1,200 over a period of 2 or so years, which allowed us to feed our daughter expensive stuff when Ann's milk failed. And when I got to Stanford, I got a very low salary to join as an assistant professor in 1959. But I figured if I were productive, they would raise my salary, but they didn't. And so I said to the chairman, what the hell's going on? I can't live on this salary. And he said, you went into the wrong part of biology. You should have become a molecular biologist, because Stanford will never pay you a living wage. You've got to find some other way to make money. And so Dick Holm and I wrote the evolution text that you mentioned, The Process of Evolution. And basically, writing books has been a way of, or at least was early on, supplementing income. On the other hand, I'm a loudmouth, I'm a propagandist, and there are a lot of things I don't like about the world. And one way of, there are two things you can do about that if you're a university professor within the game. One is to lecture on it in courses. And if you're going to prepare lecture notes, there's not a big deal to transform them into books, which therefore solves two problems to a degree in one time. And of course, Human Natures was aimed at a problem that's concerned me since I was 10 years old, and that is racism. And as you may know, in the United States, you may have even noticed that we have a thug for president who's a racist. So I think, and actually, if you actually read Human Natures, I think we said quite a bit in there about the epidemiological environment, about the kind of situation we're going to be in, that we are in now, which we wrote about starting in the 1960s and included, I'm pretty sure, in Human Natures.
Yeah, my second question was why did you get interested into writing the Human Nature's book? But I guess you have answered that a little. Uh,
Well, I'm an evolutionist.
right.
When I taught a course in evolution at Stanford, that's what they asked me to teach when they hired me. We had 10-week quarters, and I would spend 9 weeks saying how we had evolved, and the last week saying where we were going. And that became very popular, and that's what led to my career in the media. Let's put it that way.
I guess many of the questions will be directed towards how to answer the questions to the evolution deniers in our societies. But I will open the discussion for the audiences for that. But I will move towards some of the specific questions you brought in the book. One was, can our DNA explain some of our behaviors? You have mentioned in the first chapter about the Chang and Eng experiment, where there were identical boys who showed different behaviors in one of the experiments. But can we explain our behaviors by our DNA?
We can explain some parts of our behavior by our DNA. Uh, Obviously, for example, if we didn't have tongues, we wouldn't have speech. So there's how we evolved explains parts of our behavior. The vast majority of the behaviors that interest people uh, are results of cultural evolution. One thing that people should always remember is that we're a small group animal. For the vast majority of our history, we lived in groups of 50 to 100 to 150 people, the so-called Dunbar number. And that controlled an awful lot. That uh, gave us a culture that has made it very difficult for us to deal with huge groups. In other words, we're a small group animal. We've only been a large group in large groups for a few thousand years. And we were small groups for hundreds of thousands of years. And so we bring our small group culture into large groups, and we have a very, very difficult time organizing the large groups. If you want absolute proof of that, turn on your television and turn to Fox News, where you will see pure bullshit uh, flooding over the airways. Or there's a person, I think it's called the President of the United States, who is totally uneducated, has no, his culture is sort of a primitive culture. It doesn't mean he's got bad genes, although I suspect he does. But uh, basically, the answer is the things that interest us politically are virtually all culturally determined, not our DNA.
In the chat, yeah, yeah. In the chapter 2, you mentioned about one of your experiments doing in the animal house, where you could put some DTT in the larvae of the flies, and there would be DTT resistant larvae, and then the flies from there. That you call the unnatural evolution process. But since human beings started to control the environment more and more these days as the days progress, and we have become a great force of dictating evolution, not only on ourselves but also the animals and plants around us. So do you think that this kind of unnatural evolution will someday result in new species, or a
Uh,
species can
not
occur?
not a new species of humanity, although it's conceivable in millions of years. The big issue from an evolutionary point, human evolutionary point today, is after the collapse, which is virtually certain to come in the next few decades, will there be a chance to have a reset? And can we design a culture which will prevent another round of growthmanship, destruction of the environment, and collapse? And the This, of course, is not in the human natures, but the big debates among scientists who know what's happening in the world are what is going to be the cause of the collapse, and will it be so thorough that you can't have a reset? That is, if it's a worldwide nuclear war, the chances of anything surviving that will allow us to redesign and start a new culture are close to zero. If it is a financial collapse in which maybe a couple of billion people die because of what happens to the agriculture system and so on, if there's still electricity in some places, if the records of what humanity has discovered are in some places preserved, then you might be able to think about a restart of civilization, although everybody's guess on that is as good as anybody else's. What is crystal clear is we are moving very rapidly toward a collapse of civilization, as you can see in the tendency towards fascism around the world, including in the United States. Now, in the past, we've gone through fascist periods, and then there have been revolutions that have brought more democratic systems in and so on. The trouble is we're having the same old battle in a situation where the environment of the world is losing its capability of supporting humanity. In other words, just think for a moment that agriculture is utterly dependent on the climate. And we are changing the climate almost as fast as we possibly can. We're already seeing the impacts on agriculture. When people get hungry, that's not going to lead to a peaceful world. If you should be so unlucky to have a president who does not understand, for example, what will happen if there's a large-scale nuclear war, and if you have presidents elsewhere who don't understand the risk of accidental nuclear war, it's not hard to be very it's hard to be very optimistic about what's coming.
Yeah. Along with that question, I was so in some of our previous discussions with other authors, one question came up that what we can define a species as. I mean, what should be a species? How do you define a species? For example, well, Ernest Mayr has said that if two different animals cannot produce offspring, then they can be called two different species. And many biologists have taken that, have agreed with that. But some of the examples we see that, for example, Neanderthals and Homo sapiens breed, and we are the product of that. We all contain some of the DNAs from both of these species, and but they are two different species. We call them two different species. So how do you define a species?
Well, this was a huge argument in the past and remains. The problem was solved in the 1960s and 70s by papers by me and Sokol and Crivello and so on. And the answer is it's purely a cultural thing. What you see is a process of evolution, and how you chop it up and name it is basically, in one sense, arbitrary, but in another sense, very important. You'd ask what our DNA has done for us. Well, one of the things it did to make communication among human beings relatively easy was to put together a brain that categorizes things. So that, for example, although you know perfectly well that color is a continuum, that but we break it up into red, green, orange. I don't do it to red, green because I'm colorblind, but you break it up. Same thing for races. People take obvious characteristics, form ways of communicating things, so that when you look closely at how the breakup occurs, where is the division between two named colors? Where is the division between two skin colors, for example, which is part of the whole race issue? And the problem is people take these artificial categories and begin to assign all sorts of things to them. Sometimes it's useful. For instance, there was a big argument over whether or not crocodiles and birds should be put in the same taxonomic category, because in the paleontological history, crocs are the birds are more closely related to crocs than they are to other reptiles. Having the two divisions, rather than saying they're all bird crocs, it's useful to have the divisions bird and crocodile, because if somebody says a bird croc is coming towards you, you don't know whether it's going to sing you a song or eat you. And so it's useful to keep them as birds and crocodiles, even though some people would put them together into bird crocs. The whole thing is basically a croc. And anytime you see an article arguing about how to define species, you know that those are people that are probably best kept doing that sort of thing instead of sending anything useful, because they're not too bright. Arguing over how to define a species is, as I have said many times, like arguing over how to define a mountain. Is Lhotse a separate mountain from Everest, or are they two parts are they sub-mountains of each other? Is a mountain in Britain the same thing as a mountain in the Himalayas? If geologists argued eternally over how to define a mountain, we would think they are idiots. Biologists who argue over how to define species are idiots. It's very simple. An idiot's one of those categories. How do you define an idiot? Is Trump an idiot or an imbecile? And where's the dividing line? Is he evil or dumb? Where's the dividing line? We find these words very convenient to use. We know what we mean, but if you try and define them carefully, it can't be done.
Thanks. So if anyone from the audience, and especially from the Zoom link, if you want to ask questions, you can raise your hand or ask in the chat box. Feel free to do so. I will keep asking questions to Dr. Ehrlich until you ask your questions. So, do humans show any evolutionary hangover feature? You can explain what that means. You mentioned in the book that what is an evolutionary hangover?
Well, obviously, I don't use the term hangover many more, except in my own life, because I like to drink wine. But there are things that we no longer have that we no longer use or do not have the same functions. The usual example is the appendix. Nobody knows. There are ideas about what its functions are, but if it's removed, it doesn't seem to make any real difference. Evolution is, after all, a critical thing to know is that evolution isn't moving towards something. It hasn't got a plan. It basically has to tinker so that when something comes up, the environment changes. It's got to work with what it had before. It can't suddenly adapt in any way that it wants, because a good example is my back. Now, my back was originally designed by evolution to be a sling to hold up my guts between my front legs and my hind legs. And for a number of reasons, some of which we can speculate about, when our ancestors left the the smoke is getting to me. When my ancestors left the trees 6 or 8 million years ago, there was advantage to becoming upright and focusing on just balancing on your hind legs. But that left a spine that was supposed to be a sling with guts hanging beneath it upright. The guts all plunge into your pelvis, and in your pelvis that they tend to extrude through the places where the blood system goes through the pelvis, and they give you hernias, men and women. So that's the weakness of your spine is a hangover from evolution, which if there had actually been a designer would not have designed it that way. We are there. What you can see in human beings and other organisms, uh, if special creation was real, if there was actually a supernatural monster who designed us, which some people actually believe even today, but if there was, you got to see there's a lot of low IQ design, idiot designers, because nobody would ever design a human spine like it is. And we all suffer from it. Our big mistake is standing on our hind legs. On the other hand, it gave us some wonderful advantages, like freeing our front legs to do things like build computers. And evolution is always has a lot of these kinds of trade-offs.
Yeah, thanks. Coach, do we want to ask any question? Go ahead, please.
Yeah, well, a lot of our viewers are interested in knowing how humans are still evolving, whether if they're evolving.
I didn't quite catch it.
So a lot of our viewers are interested in knowing how humans are still evolving, if they are
How humans did what?
how
Yeah, are humans
evolving.
still evolving?
Oh, are humans still evolving? Yes, of course. We're still evolving culturally, and we're still evolving biologically. The critical issue that has to be understood to understand human evolution, a critical issue, is evolution goes on in generation time. For example, you mentioned the research that I did long before you were born on the evolution of DDT resistance in fruit flies. If you put DDT in the medium on which you raise some fruit flies and no DDT in the other, the ones that survive on the DDT medium and breed from them every generation, in about 10 generations, you'll have fruit flies that love DDT. And this was the work that many people were doing in the 1940s and 50s, and which told us that it would be insane to do what we today do with antibiotics, because we're, getting rid of the usefulness of antibiotics. Fruit flies can have a generation in 10 days or a couple of weeks. Human beings have a generation in 20 years. People used to say to me, well, if fruit flies can get DDT resistant, why should we worry about DDT? We can get DDT resistant too. That's true. If you had, say, 95 or 98% of all human beings poisoned with DDT to die for a few hundred years, we would have DDT resistant human beings. It seems unlikely that that's a very good way to do it, to kill off almost 100% of the people by poisoning them with DDT for several hundred years. But that's 10 generations in human beings. And we used to kill off 99% of the fruit flies with DDT. Anyway, we are certainly continuing to evolve, but the rate of our actual genetic evolution is relatively slow because of our slow generation time. The best example I know of genetic evolution in human being, right off the top of my head, is related to a disease called sickle cell anemia. In Africa, where many of all of our ancestors came from originally, there's a very nasty form of malaria that selected human beings to have characteristic red blood cells that were somewhat resistant to the most nasty form of malaria, falciparum malaria. And when a huge number of Africans were brought as slaves to the United States, along with them came that resistance to the malaria. Unfortunately, a side effect of having that particular gene, when you had it homozygous, which was a small portion of the population, is a nasty disease. And so it remained in the population where there was falciparum malaria, because the malaria was more dangerous than the gene. However, when the Africans came over here and malaria was wiped out largely in the United States, the selection pressure for the gene was reduced, and it has reduced the amount of sickle cell anemia in the human population in North America. And if we persisted for another, I suspect, few hundred years in North America, that particular disease and that gene would probably disappear from the population through selection, and that would be natural or natural evolution, basically.
Yeah.
Sorry, do you want to talk about the very recent paper you were mentioning about jaw evolution? Because in our countries as well, in India and Bangladesh, we see increase in usage of dental braces. I think that will be relevant to our audience as well.
Well, that's a good place for me to mention my own stupidity and embarrassment. I got to know an orthodontist, someone who works on the configuration of your jaws and teeth, because we had a mutual, Dr. Sandra Khan, because we had a mutual interest in conservation, and we were introduced by a friendly couple from Mexico that I'd done a lot of work with, the guy on the extinction crisis. Gerardo Ceballos and his wife Pupo were very friendly with Sandra and her husband David, she was born in Mexico but lives here in the Bay Area. And we discovered a mutual interest in fermented grape juice. Have you ever tried fermented grape juice? Sometimes it's called wine. We used to have talk about conservation over in wine dinners, and she began to tell me about her concern about the way the orthodontic profession was going. It wasn't getting the results that she thought it ought to get, and so on. And it had not dawned on me as an evolutionist, and this is where my stupidity really shows through. Why in hell should most of the kids I know have mouths full of metal to rearrange their teeth? No, it doesn't make any sense from an evolutionary point of view. And we began talking about it, and it became crystal clear to me that evolution was not at all involved, the genetic evolution. It was cultural evolution. We have brought hunter-gatherer genes for jaws and teeth into a McDonald's environment. And we wrote a book called Jaws about it. If any of you have young children, the book is nonprofit. You should look at the book and find out what to do about it. But the basic answer is that we stopped needing teeth that could gnaw down on our tough food, because we don't have any tough food anymore. We have changed our diets dramatically so that almost everything is close to liquid. And in fact, there is now a commercial substance called, I can't remember the exact name of it, but anyway, it's so you can drink all your foods. You don't do any chewing. Well, imagine what would happen to your legs if, when a kid was born, it was prevented from ever walking. What would happen to you if you just became a total couch potato? That your genes haven't changed, but your environment has, and your muscles and bones and so on all relate to your environment. And it's still a fairly complex question, exactly what aspects of our environment besides the soft food are responsible for the change in our jaws. But what is crystal clear is it's a very serious disease, because the fact that your teeth don't fit anymore, for instance, your third molars become wisdom teeth because there's no room left in your jaw for them to erupt, and so on, leads to a disease called sleep apnea. And many of my friends, the people I know, are on special CPAP machines at night, so that they don't have sleep apnea, which is interruption of your sleep through cutting off of your windpipe, of your air supply, because your small jaws don't have room for your tongue falls back into your airway, and you wake up. And there's a huge literature showing the connection between sleep deprivation and disease and early death. It's tied into cancer, lung, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, also road accident, and being butchered by interns in hospitals, because when you deprive people of sleep, they become incompetent and they die earlier of various diseases. So the fact that everybody in many countries are getting their teeth very crooked, all the orthodontists are basically doing is temporarily moving the teeth into a better, more attractive cosmetic pattern. They're not doing anything at all about the growth of the jaw, which is something, if it's going in the wrong direction, you need to intervene in the first couple of years of life, whereas most orthodontists won't do anything till you're 8, 9, or 10, which is like if you see your kid is going blind, the doctor says, it's losing his sight. Say, why don't we just wait till he's totally blind and then we'll do something about it? So it's an evolutionary problem. It's a cultural evolutionary problem that, like many others, is like much of the so-called race, structural racism is basically a cultural problem. There are no human races genetically. There's genetic variation, but they're not units that you can assign things to, and yet people treat it. It's one of the reasons I wrote the book, is people treat it as if DNA was determining not just your skin color or the shape of your hair or your shape of your nose or your height or so on, but also determining your more intellectual characteristics, which is pure nonsense and has been shown to be pure nonsense extensively. It still persists.
Thanks. Yeah.
I got to
So
have a little gin now. We'll talk about Trump.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, sorry.
MK Badun, he wants to ask a question. Please go ahead.
Hi, Paul. Great to see you. So I have read many of your scholarly articles, especially on conservation biology. So my question is about conservation, not about evolution in particular. So I would like to know, what do you think that if we protect half of the world, would it be a meaningful conservation outcome, when we know that now, given our economic pattern and the growth we are having at global scale, which is disproportionately affecting global south? Do you think that if we only protect half of the world, that would be a positive outcome in terms of conservation, when climate change is affecting global south disproportionately?
One of the, of course, big problems with, as you know, with climate change is if you set aside parks and so on, the boundaries of the parks don't move along with the, so it's like the marine conservation zones. As the temperature of the ocean changes in various patterns, you find out the conservation zones are in the wrong place. Same thing with parks. The idea of saving half of the planet for the other organisms which we are part of and which we depend upon is a wonderful idea. It's a wonderful idea, like peace among men. That is, it's a nice thing to say, but how the hell do you get there? And what do you do? How do you pick the half of the planet when the things we're doing is changing the environment of the entire planet? So what you pick that's good for this year may not be worth a damn in 20 years, certainly won't be worth a damn in 200 years if you last that long. Did I answer your question? I'm not sure.
Yes, you did. But then what about you? You mentioned about cultural, evolution. So what is your take on how human behavior will change in next decade or in next, next 10 to 20 years, in terms of the economic growth we're approaching, which is very extractive, like.
Let me give you a commercial. There's an outfit called The Mob, MAHB, and you can find out about them at a website mahb.stanford,
Yeah, I am
Stanford,
putting them in the chat box for
.edu.
everyone.
Okay, great.
Yeah. Yeah.
This was in the year roughly around 2000. There was a millennium assessment of ecosystem assessment, which basically was asking what's the state of the world's life support systems, which they discovered, to not the surprise of anybody that'd been following it, that it's in terrible shape and going downhill. And back then, Ann and I, and joined by Don Kennedy, who was then the president of Stanford, founded a group which we called the Mob, because we meant that we wanted to have a millennium assessment of human behavior, because we thought the big problem was not finding out what was happening to the world's life support systems, because there was a huge literature and everybody who had read it knew what was happening to the life support systems. What we didn't know was why wasn't anybody doing anything about it. And that's what the Mob was designed to look at. And that is still, from my point of view, the big question today. In other words, I'm a conservation biologist. My training was in evolution and conservation and genetics. I don't think we need any more research in those areas to know what we should be doing. We don't have to study human genetics anymore to know that systemic racism is not just evil, it's slowing down any process we might make towards making the world a better place, and so on. What we need to understand much better is human behavior and human evolution, but it's a slow process, and we don't get to employ what we know. In other words, as you can see, the Republican convention was basically a blizzard of lies. Anything biological in there was lied about. Anything cultural in there was lied about. So I don't want to depress you, but I talked to a group of the U.S. National Academy of Sciences colleagues a couple of months ago now, and I said that if you care about the future and you care about science, unless you're working on, say, a vaccine for SARS-2 or something like that, the only thing you should be doing professionally between now and November is doing anything you can to prevent the re-election of the present group of thugs to office. I'm not saying the Democrats are going to do all the right things and do the things that the scientific community thinks should be done, but there you at least have a sensible person in charge and will attempt to do the right thing, as the Obama administration attempted to do. Remember, the Obama administration had established warning systems for pandemics, which were dissolved by the Trump administration. The Obama administration had started on climate change issues, which are called a hoax. You know, here I am sitting in the middle of a hoax in a smoky room with climate change caused fires burning all around me. So I feel the same way about the basic conservation problem. We have got to change education. We've got to change culture. It's going to be a gigantic job if we try. You can see, for example, for our statistical geneticist, one of the things we've failed to teach the American public is what the hell exponential growth is. You can see that in all the attitudes on the spread of the virus. I used to like to tell my students to remember that a long history of exponential growth does not imply a long future of exponential growth. And I actually finally heard a scientist on one of the channels use the old lily pad example to explain that. We've done a miserable job of educating our public. I hate to say it. I feel guilty.
Thanks. So what
you.
could have been the selective advantage that led to the evolution of consciousness of human?
You know, you guys really know how to ask those questions. I read Dan Dennett's book on explaining consciousness, and I didn't learn a damn thing. And this is you know, when I was a kid, when I was, say, 12 years old, my biggest fear was that the scientists would learn everything before I had a chance to become a scientist. Of all the empty, when you look at even the things we don't know about the COVID, the SARS-2 virus.
Every scientist's nightmare.
Yeah, every scientist's nightmare, which is preposterous. And one of the, you know, there are the questions that I think I will die soon enough anyway, without getting the answers to include how does the brain put together consciousness? What does it mean? And is that even a good question? And another one is, why is there anything at all? You know, why? It's related to solipsism and so on. There are huge numbers of questions that are fascinating that we don't know the answer to. And consciousness is one of the they found a lot of things about our brains that we didn't know and that are mystifying. That, for example, you can be afraid of something before you know you're afraid of it. That is, the parts of the brain that generate fear, part of the limbic system, as I recall, I'm no brain, light up before you're conscious of the fact that the lion is about to eat you, which is obviously an evolutionary advantage if you can get the information quicker. So there's lots of really interesting stuff, but I cannot explain consciousness to you. I wish I could.
Yeah. So one of the related question probably, we know that our modern human brain is, I mean, the biologists, evolutionary biologists say that 100,000 years ago, the brain would be similar as the modern human brain now. But some of the behaviors and some of the developments during the civilization and being a civilized human being is a very recent product. Why is it that? I mean, why didn't we invent agriculture far back?
Again, nobody's sure. Certainly a lot of it is cultural. That is one of the things that has given us many of the advantages, and some of them may not be advantages, has been the ability, first of all, to talk, to communicate about abstract things. Lots of animals communicate in various ways, but few animals ask the question, why is there anything? And then, of course, being able to print and pass it around and make sure, rather than just orally transmitting history, putting the lessons in ways that could be preserved was very, very important. Why? And of course, what actually happened in the brain during those transitions is still an open question. For a long time, they didn't think any new neurons were produced during a human lifespan. Now they think they are. So how the Neanderthal brain, for example, differs from ours, we know, if I recall correctly, it's slightly larger. But obviously, there are things in the organization that make ours very different from the Neanderthals, at least in the cultural record left. There's a wonderful new book on bird brains by a Jennifer. I can't remember the exact title, but it raises an interesting question, which the author didn't, but I did in a review. Namely, is the fact that hummingbirds are able to make decisions and navigate much better than Donald Trump, is that a function of the way the neurons are arranged in a hummingbird's brain, or just because the hummingbird's brain is so much larger? And that's a kind of question I think we ought to do more research on.
Okay, thanks.
You
you
exhausted my
mentioned.
entire knowledge of brains.
Okay, so because you were talking about brains, I'm going to ask you one of the questions here about Phineas Gage. His brain is one of the most given examples in one of the psychology classes, that he got struck by a metal object in his brain. He survived, recovered completely, but his behavior changed completely. He became more agitated, vulgar, and stuff. So that this example is given as that if you change a part of your brain, your behavior may change completely. My
And
question is, some of the psychopaths or people having problem in their brain, they have different kind of behavior. How would we explain them to the society that if they make a crime or does something that is not that is completely biological, cannot be explained by them doing something uh, intentionally? You know what I mean?
well, these are, again, very difficult questions. What do we know? We know, for example, that if you are blinded by an accident, that in many cases, the parts of your brain that dealt with vision can more or less convert to parts that deal with hearing, and that they're very famous case of the flexibility of the brain, but also the concentration of functions in different areas, is a case that I think we wrote about in the book, where a railroad worker had a bar driven through his eye and out the top of his head, took out part of his frontal cortex, and it changed his personality completely, but did not prevent him from doing his job, walking, talking, and so on. And there is, for example, recent years have shown that emotions are controlled in some parts of the brain, as opposed to reasoning, which is concentrated mostly in the cortex. And interestingly, if you destroy have a lesion in the part of the brain that really controls emotions, it has a very interesting effect. Namely, it destroys your decision-making ability. You can know the menu of every restaurant in town, but you can't decide where to eat. So there's lots of stuff in the brain, and certainly some of the psychopaths we know, it's possible, for example, that in development, some part of Trump's brain was damaged. That is an area which controls your empathetic feelings, your emotions, and so on, and turns, the narcissism can have a biological basis. We just don't know about it. We do know that personality changes with brain damage. So that tells you something about how the brain is designed to do things. And if you damage it, it doesn't do it so well anymore than if you smash your elbow and it can't be fixed, you find it a little hard to play tennis.
So how does gossiping help human evolution? I mean, how did it help?
Gossiping?
Yeah, we are talkative beings, and
well, again, it allows. There's a lot of evidence that in many circumstances, problems are better solved by groups than by single geniuses. That the interactions, I've seen this in my history as a faculty member, say 60 years. One of the things that's missed a lot in the process of getting disadvantaged peoples into faculty positions and so on is that a person joining a group of really highly skilled, bright other people can change in a positive direction very well. Whereas if they're moved into a group of sluggards, if they join the Republican Party, say, they may just get dumber. And so gossiping is part of our group interactions. They're extremely important. And there's even signs in other primates that things like grooming and so on can substitute for gossiping and have positive effects on the ability of the group to deal with problems. So I'm a great fan of gossip. I love jokes, and my favorite thing that has gone around the web recently is a picture of Trump saying, "I want you all to crowd into your church services." That's the top of it, without masks. And the bottom picture is Charles Darwin saying, "I'm Charles Darwin and I approve of this message."
Okay. Uh, yeah. So one of the other questions I was going to ask is, what is the source of our altruistic behavior? I mean, humans don't only have the altruism, but other animals. For example, you have given an example in the book about squirrels giving the warning calls, but sacrificing him or herself to warn the groups about some danger. Uh, how how did it evolve?
Well, I think it probably evolved in the same way it evolved in human beings. That is, uh, natural selection basically is a system where people with certain organisms with certain sets of DNA reproduce better and more than those with other sets of DNA. And one of the big things that we've learned, that I've learned in when I went originally to work at Gombe Stream, where Jane Goodall worked with the chimpanzees, I was determined to look at the chimps as basically automata, that they were, that you didn't want to, because they look so much like people, you didn't want to interpret their behavior in human terms. Lasted for me about 3 seconds when a young chimp, scared by something, jumped into his mother's arms and his mother patted its head and so on. But what's built up since then is a very big literature showing that emotions go much further than Homo sapiens. Some people claim all the way down to fruit flies, and that their book, a book by Carl Safina called Beyond Words. I can recommend highly to any of your readers Safina's book, Beyond Words, on that.
Beyond words?
Beyond Words.
Okay.
Beyond, WRDS.
Yeah.
And Jennifer Eberhardt, EBERHARDT, Jennifer Eberhardt.
Okay.
Biased, BIASED.
Yeah.
Which, well, in cultural evolution, will let you think about your own biases. How you actually, do you have a bias when you see somebody of a different skin color? Do you have a bias when you go into a restaurant to eat? And lots and lots of examples. A brilliant, absolutely brilliant book for today. That the Safina book will help you think about other organisms, and the Eberhard book will help you think about yourself. Somebody just appeared.
Yeah, as people keeps joining or leaves from the room. So yeah. So one of the questions one of the audiences asked me before, and you talked about it a little in your book, and a lot of things have been changed over the last 20 years since you have written the book. Can we explain homosexuality by our genes?
Yeah, I think so. It's common in the animal kingdom, and maybe a parallel is a better way of explaining it. Do you know about the Hadza grandmothers? Yeah, one of the questions asked is, why do women have menopause when men remain fertile until they're 110? And the basic answer was, it was originally put together on the basis of an African group called the Hadza, which lived by Western standards, a rather primitive life, that if the name of the game in evolution is passing on your kind of DNA, your genes to future generations, you can pass on more of your kind of genes if you're a woman by stopping reproducing yourself at a certain stage and helping your daughters produce. And particularly in human beings, because of our intelligence, birth used to be a very dangerous process. Getting a large head through a pelvis that was still small enough so you could walk upright means the baby has to turn in several directions, very difficult things. And in almost all human, I think in all human cultures, women tend to want to have other women pick other women to help them in the birth process. And so it's turned out that the Hadza female idea, namely that it's better not to, as you get old and frail, try and reproduce yourself. It's better to help out your people with the same genes. Turns out to work in birds and a lot of other places. And it's the same idea with homosexuality, namely that you can be more reproductively successful in many circumstances by not reproducing yourself, by helping close relatives to reproduce. My philosophy personally on it comes from a young woman who was a friend of my closest friend in graduate school in the University of Kansas. And she said, if it's physically possible and fun, I'm for it. So
Sure.
I think that one of the places, by the way, while we've been going backwards on most of the issues that I care about for the last since Ronald Reagan, we have at least been successful to a large degree on the LGBTQ issues,
Right.
on the issues of gender equity. And I think that's a very positive sign for our society.
Right. Yeah. And United States have seen some more changes over the last 100 years. For example, the people of colors, they got more access to the education. Women got access to higher education, and these kind of improvements.
If you had asked me these questions in 1975, I'd say we're moving in the right directions. It was Ronald Reagan who basically, tried to turn it around. And I mean, the war on women now is particularly grim. And of course, we haven't solved that problem globally. If you want to get an equity problem, I think probably more people are disadvantaged because they're female than because they have a darker skin color.
Right.
It's
right, and within a certain skin colored society, the women will be more deprived than the men in that setting.
They are in virtually every society.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
Which is
same as.
But I mean, also,
country.
We've had some local successes here in evolutionary biology, particularly in ecology. Women are beginning to even approach dominance. I have 2 of my graduate students have been elected to the American National Academy of Sciences, both of them women.
Great.
So we are making progress, and scientists are working there's a lot of systemic sexism and racism in science, but the scientists are beginning to recognize it and do stuff about it.
And one of the questions I was mentioning in the beginning is that how to solve the problem of people denying evolution in a society, and mostly very religiously biased conservative society where people who study science, biological science, read about evolution, gets the facts but deny it. How do you solve this kind of problem?
Well, it's a problem I've been trying to solve for roughly 60, 70 years, and I failed totally. I mean, even if we had simple understanding of evolution, we would not be in the situation we are now with the pandemic. In other words, we don't understand a lot of basic things about evolution. And for example, we still overuse antibiotics, even though we knew way back in the 40s and 50s what would happen. We would get resistance to it. And we're going to run into these kinds of problems with the SARS too. I mean, for example, we can guess what way, one of the things we don't want to have happen is the SARS-2 turn out to be transmissible by mosquitoes. Because if it is, the virus is likely to evolve towards more lethality. On the other hand, if it's only transmitted by contact, as it appears to be now, by respiratory, then it's likely to remain or evolve towards more being less lethal. Why is that? Because the virus's DNA has the same goal as your DNA. If you want to talk anthropomorphically, right. It wants to reproduce. And if its victims are able to walk around, it can make more viruses by infecting more people. If, on the other hand, the victims are so sick they lie in bed, that's bad for the virus, unless mosquitoes transmit it, in which case the mosquitoes bite the people in the bed easier than they did the people who are walking around. So, I mean, there's evolution everywhere, both cultural, which we don't understand very well often, and biological going on all the time. And thinking that the world is a fixed place is just nuts. Religion was a perfectly reasonable idea for chimpanzees. In other words, they didn't understand what was happening when they began to see things results they didn't see the cause of, like lightning or death. Then they invented creatures like themselves because they were the only things they'd ever seen to do intentional things. And so it made sense to invent gods that were like themselves. And that's, crystal clear. We know why religion evolved. What we don't understand entirely is why it persists. But of course, it saves a lot of decision making. It gives people stories that make them feel comfortable. And in some cases, it does good for the world. When you see, for example, the Pope saying that climate change is a danger to the creation, that's good.
Yeah, of course.
And we all have our fantasies after all. What the hell?
Yeah, of course. MK Badun wants to ask an additional question. We are close to the discussion today, but we will take one or two more questions.
Okay, because I've got another thing at quarter past.
5 minutes should be fine.
5 minutes, fine.
Okay,
Badun, I'm having a good time. You ask good questions.
Well, you mentioned about Pope mentioning about climate change. So, do you think we have already passed the enlightenment, and now we should seek hope to Pope? Do you think this is ideal situation to? I know Pope is himself is a very influential person, but in terms of saving environment or saving Earth from climate change, do you need to depend on any statement from Pope? And how much this all these things like educating evolution science to everyone, and also how to fight climate change, also protect the environment, how much political all these aspects have become, especially after Trump administration. So, and my last question is, you have been a pioneer academia, and what would be your suggestion, given the current global situation, what would be your suggestion to your students? Like, if you consider me as your student, what would be your suggestion, like to us, like how we could face, all these problems in next 20 years or 30 years?
What I always push to go more or less to your last part first, I always pushed my students, and I would push you to read some of the anti-federalist and federalist debate about the US Constitution, because if you look back to the 18th century, there were 13 basically different countries in North America. They fought with each other sometimes. They had different religions. They had different positions on all sorts of things. After they got freedom from England, they faced the problem of how do you remain distinct in good ways, but also how were you able to get together to do things like keep the British out if they came back, or determine trade policies and international affairs and so on. Exactly the same kind of problem the globe is facing today, where how do you keep your group somewhat distinct in ways that you like, but still solve the problems of climate change and racism and so on, which are really global problems. And I would urge you and youngsters like you to get very much involved in those issues. And in terms of the US situation and so on, I'm a pedant. Education is part of it, but also learning to work with other people. In other words, I differ in many dimensions with the Pope, but he's a good guy. He's trying to do good for the world. And one of my oldest friends and my first graduate student is a Jesuit who has run several Jesuit universities. He started a zero population growth chapter in one of them. We've argued about religion for now 70 some years. On the other hand, we've worked together to try and make the world a better place. So try and appreciate other people's point of view, which with Trump and me, it's very difficult. I have to admit, I sometimes fail, but there are a lot of serious people who will disagree with you, but will try and help save the world. Are you interested in political science?
Yes, I am interested in political ecology.
Well, if you want to learn about American politics, there are a lot of excellent books. I won't bother to recommend any, but I'm very interested. After all, politics is a big part of human evolution, right? And what we manage to do with our evolution is very, very political. And one of the things that I think we need now is much more open politics. I'm a great fan of demonstrations. I hope they don't turn violent, but I do think some people would look better as heads on pikes, I have to admit.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. I will end this discussion with one or two more questions. They're related. So you wrote this book 20 years back, and while the Human Genome Sequence project was going on at the time, now many things have changed. And if you write the book again, or if you want to edit it, what things you are going to change? That's my one question. And another one is, are you writing anything now?
Well, the first question is, I would obviously make a lot of changes in the book because we know a lot more about some things. And I would, because I tend to be a politician part-time, I would put even more effort into things like systemic racism and so on. Shirley Feldman and I wrote an entire book on race, but it was 20 years before that. And we still haven't gotten the word out on very, very basic things. So I would put more of that in. I'm writing a book now on population extinctions, which is another big issue, which ties in with the species definition thing. But I wonder if any of the books will have any impact anymore. We'll see. Anyway, it's been fun talking to your people.
Yeah, it was really fun, and your book really was wonderful to read, and we have learned a lot. And thanks for being with us today, and thanks to the audience.
It was my pleasure. Thank you.
Take care.
Take care. Bye. Bye.